Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good evening, and maybe even good morning, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. A very, very warm welcome to you to the final conference of the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequality. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it is an absolute pleasure to serve you as the moderator of your opening and closing plenary sessions. Now, we've connected from all over the world today to really share the results of 3 years of research that has birthed 23 projects that has touched more than 20 countries. And our aim today is really to use this final conference as an opportunity to draw conclusions and to really use the insights that we get from the contributions to inform public policy, but also to inform development cooperation strategies. In addition to this, I think it is also an opportunity for us to use this conversation and this moment as a launching pad as we look at the next stage of the project, which is, of course, to move far more deliberately from results to policy and impact. And so over the next 4 days, ladies and gentlemen, the invitation is open to you, an invitation for you to connect with, engage with policymakers, with leaders in academia, leaders in civil society, and leaders from international organizations. And just maybe one of the ways that we're going to be doing this is by inviting you to please look to the right side of your screen, where you will see that we have a Slido capability. What this means is that you'll be able to send me questions and comments that I'm going to try to the best of my ability to integrate into the conversation and to pull those questions into the panel discussions so that your voice is indeed included in this very important moment. What we're also doing is, of course, creating opportunities for you to connect with each other and to network with each other. So I certainly hope that you're going to be taking full advantage of this. We are amplifying this conversation on social media. We're using the hashtag Research Inequalities, and we're live tweeting today. So we're really hoping that you're going to participate in that global online conversation as well. You'll also note, ladies and gentlemen, that we do have French and English interpretation. So we do hope that you are included as much as possible in the conversation. For now, though, we're going to start off with 2 keynote contributions. And it's really my pleasure at this moment to introduce the European Union Commissioner from the Directorate General for International Partnerships in the European Commission. Her name is Madame Jutta URPILAINEN, and she is standing by to share with us her insights as she kicks off the keynote address for today. To you, Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. To fight inequalities and to fight against inequalities. And my reasoning for that is very simple. No one chooses where they are born, and no one chooses who their parents are. But as policymakers, we can work to ensure that one's origin does not predestine one to a life of inequalities. And this has been very, very clear principle to me. The COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on the health systems, societies and economies has been like an X-ray. Unfortunately, it has also exposed inequalities. It has hit the most vulnerable, making it harder to leave no one behind. So it is clear that we have to respond. And as a Commissioner for International Partnerships, I am putting the fight against inequalities at the heart of our international cooperation. We must tackle inequalities by making them a cross-cutting objective. We must address economic, social, and environmental inequalities, working closely with countries and international partners. So let me explain my vision for tackling inequalities in 3 points. Firstly, a fair economy and fiscal policy especially. Opportunities are balanced with obligations. If everyone pays their fair share of taxes, there are more opportunities for education, public healthcare, and social protection. The EU stands fully behind the Addis tax initiative to raise more domestic revenue and improve tax systems to address inequalities. We need institutions that really work for people. We have already seen how domestic resource mobilization can improve through the introduction of performance indicators in budget support programs. In countries in Africa, it increased tax to GDP ratios by 2 percentage points between 2015 and 2019. Alongside raising more revenue, we must fight tax evasion, illicit financial flows and corruption, and to curb economic inequality. We estimate more than 700 million euros outflows from illicit financial flows from Africa alone. So this figure speaks volumes. To give a little bit perspective, this alone could bridge half of the continent's SDG financing gap. So we need to turn this tide together with our partners. Fiscal policy is an issue of national sovereignty. Every country, of course, must find its own inclusive reforms that strengthen the middle class and also address the informal sector. As partners, we can help assess systems, build capacity, provide expertise to implement and really share best practices. We will also support civil society as the vital watchdogs. And of course, we must ourselves walk the talk. For the EU, this means, for example, that we move ahead on country-by-country reporting of taxes by multinational companies to combat the tax evasion and avoidance. My second point is about investing in people and planet. Human development, especially quality education, is one of the most powerful equalizers in society. The pandemic has disrupted the education of hundreds of millions of children around the world. And there is a real risk that many of these young people, girls in particular, may never return to school. So this is why I have decided to increase spending on education in partner countries from 7% to at least 10%. And this will reach every girl and every boy, support teachers' training, and help match skills with jobs. As important as human development is, of course, the future of the planet we call home. Climate change and environmental degradation increase inequalities, affecting poorer countries and communities across the world first and hardest. The European Green Deal is an ambitious growth strategy. It accelerates the transition towards a low carbon and sustainable future that leaves no one behind. So as a commissioner, I will harness the EU's partnership worldwide for a truly global, green and fair transition for all. The important question is how we will achieve these commitments. We are now programming our actions for next 7 years with our new Global Europe NDP instrument, which we adopted last week. And this is, of course, a huge opportunity to mainstream inequalities and put the fight against inequalities at the heart of our action. And I want to do it in the most effective way together with the EU member states. Our Team Europe way of working will be instrumental for the push for greater equality and equity, both in partner countries and globally. Team Europe emerged at the start of the pandemic. We needed scale, coordination, and focus to support partners with maximum impact. And it is now part of the fabric of our external actions. We have now an opportunity to develop Team Europe initiatives as equality flagships. So we count on the member states, including France, and development finance institutions to help make that happen. So, dear friends, then third and my final point. One of the greatest inequalities is the feeling that you don't belong anywhere. Sustainable development and equal opportunities depend on democracy, on strong institutions, social inclusion, and participation. And this is why fighting inequalities also means investing in functioning states and resilient societies. With our new action plan on human rights and democracy, we are committed to promote democratic values. This means healthy institutions and thriving civil society and media. But it also means empowering young people and women, and ensuring their participation in the decision-making process. There will be no sustainable global recovery without them in the driving seat. So, dear colleagues, I would like to end by, of course, thanking the EU AFD Research Facility for your insightful and thorough work. With the tools and methods you have developed, we will be able to increase the impact of our international cooperation on reducing inequalities. SDG number 10, the first global goal dedicated to reducing inequalities, really, it unites us. We have the vision, we have the policies, the partnerships, and the tools. So now it is up to us to make this change happen. And as you can see, I am very committed to be part of this approach together with you. Thank you very much.
It's a massive thank you to you, Commissioner, for really getting us started with a beautiful framing of the conversations that are to follow. You started off by reminding us of the impact of COVID-19 and how it's been almost like an X-ray that has really exposed the deep inequalities that we see in our societies. But you've also come forward and we've put on the table many ways in which public policy can ensure that where one started does not mean that that's where their life needs to end. And so we hear you, Commissioner, as you talk about fiscal policy as one of those tools, as you talk about education and climate change policies, and of course, as you look at social inclusion as one of the ways that we can be far more deliberate about reducing inequalities in our societies. A massive thank you for your contribution and a really insightful keynote address. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do now is we're going to turn to our second keynote. We have had the privilege of receiving a video recording from Mr. Clément. He is, of course, the French Secretary of State to the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, please turn your attention to this message from Mr. BEAUNE.
Madame la commissaire, chère Jutta URPILAINEN, messieurs les directeurs généraux, cher Rémi Rioux, cher Koen, mesdames et messieurs, je suis très heureux d'être avec vous par vidéo interposée aujourd'hui pour aborder cette question essentielle de la lutte contre les inégalités. Et je sais l'ampleur de votre action, celle de la Commission européenne, celle de l'Agence française de développement, dans un moment, la crise mondiale que nous connaissons, qui est sanitaire, qui est économique, qui est sociale, dont nous savons qu'elle va renforcer inévitablement dans nos pays, partout dans le monde, le risque d'inégalité, les risques de fracture dans nos sociétés. Et l'action que vous menez sera encore plus essentielle. Je veux rappeler quelques aspects parce que nous sous-estimons parfois ce que l'équipe d'Europe fait en matière de développement, de lutte contre les inégalités dans le monde. L'équipe d'Europe, qui a été si active pendant cette crise en particulier, en réunissant davantage encore nos efforts, nos compétences et nos actions, c'est le premier bailleur, le premier soutien à l'aide au développement dans le monde. Nous ne le disons pas assez, nous ne le faisons pas assez valoir et notre rôle sera plus primordial encore à l'issue de cette crise. Nous avons aussi en France renforcé notre action pour le développement et donc pour la lutte contre les inégalités, avec un engagement financier plus important, 0,55% du RNB à l'horizon 2022, pour nous remettre sur un chemin crédible vers l'objectif de 0,7%, avec une loi pour le développement qui vient d'être adoptée dans la première de nos assemblées avant de poursuivre sa route parlementaire dans les semaines qui viennent et qui est essentielle. Mais plus largement, c'est la notion même d'inégalité que nous devons interroger. Nous savons, vous le savez, mieux que personne, les politiques de développement ne sont plus centrées sur l'idée d'augmenter la croissance en général, d'augmenter le revenu moyen sans se préoccuper de la répartition des richesses, d'éléments plus qualitatifs, l'attention au climat, à l'éducation, des jeunes filles en particulier. Et donc c'est cet engagement que nous devons mettre en œuvre. Et dans ce cadre, vous avez pris, il y a maintenant plus de 3 ans, depuis 2017, une initiative originale, celle qui d'abord réunit les institutions européennes et l'Agence française de développement, et je veux saluer ce partenariat, pour mener des actions de recherche avec les pays concernés, plus de 23 projets dans 20 pays, pour analyser la question des inégalités, la façon dont les politiques de développement peuvent mieux contribuer à la réduction de ces inégalités. Vous avez consacré plus de 4 millions déjà à ces financements et ces actions de recherche locales. Et à partir de cette année, nous relancerons ensemble des financements, plus de 3 millions d'euros de nouveau, pour continuer cette action. Et pour en tirer ensuite des recommandations concrètes, pas des actions théoriques, pour améliorer la qualité et l'impact de nos politiques de développement. Cette équipe d'Europe, cette attention aux inégalités, cet engagement pour le développement, c'est profondément notre modèle européen. Nous devons renforcer notre capacité d'action commune et votre partenariat en témoigne. Nous devons renforcer nos financements, je le disais, et nous devons être les premiers acteurs de la réduction des inégalités dans le monde. C'est un combat que nous pouvons gagner et que l'après-crise rendra plus essentiel que jamais. Merci beaucoup, bon courage pour vos travaux, bon courage pour les actions que vous menez sur ce sujet essentiel. À très bientôt.
EU's guide on addressing inequality. This is an opportunity for us through this video to really get into some of the practical ways in which we can sustainably begin to reduce inequality. Straight after that, I'm going to be picking up and introducing our high-level panel, which is standing by for a robust conversation with you. For now, here's a short video.
Inequality refers to the unequal distribution of goods, resources and rights, and can have a profound impact on all dimensions of sustainable development, especially poverty, hindering poverty reduction efforts and growth. It can be measured in terms of opportunities or outcomes between people who have a shared identity, such as gender, ethnicity, religion, or geographical location, and be manifested in incomes, social goods, environmental resources, or decision-making. The EU has produced a guide to help make its development cooperation more effective in addressing inequalities. It comprises 3 volumes. Volume 1 on the concepts. Volume 2 includes a set of 18 policy briefs for the design of policies. Volume 3 outlines the guiding principles and tools to mainstream the reduction of inequalities across all operations. The focus is on economic inequality, which is the difference between people in terms of income, money received, consumption, goods and services purchased, wealth, the sum of assets. These concepts are explained in Volume 1 on the theoretical background and trends. Total income equality is neither possible nor desirable. The objective is to have less income inequality with a focus on extreme disparities, as called for by the 2030 Agenda. There are diverse factors that determine income inequality, including trade, taxation and transfers, migration, demography, education and health, functioning of institutions, democracy and social cohesion, gender policies, economic development and shocks, the labour market, natural resources and infrastructure. Volume 2 of the guide presents 18 policy briefs to guide the design of different policies linked to these issues. The EU believes that development cooperation must be more responsive to the challenge of reducing inequalities and addressing its causes. The guide demonstrates how EU cooperation can better address the drivers of inequality by investing in education, widening access to land and finance, addressing gender inequalities, using digitalization to serve the needs of the poorest, promoting decent work, targeting investments for the bottom 40%, maximizing the employment potential of investment and trade, supporting resource mobilization and progressive fiscal policies, providing universal social protection and health coverage, fighting climate change, protecting the most vulnerable. Volume 3 presents a set of guiding principles and recommendations and is packed full of useful tools to help EU staff and partners mainstream the reduction of inequalities across all operations. By using an inequality lens, we can be challenged to think differently about the opportunities and outcomes of our cooperation. 4 core principles are recommended. They are: apply the beneficiary approach through participation and consultation, promote accountability and transparency, redistribution and the targeting of the bottom 40%, address spatial inequalities and inequalities between groups. Volume 3 proposes options on how to address difficult challenges, as inequality can be contentious. Structural causes of inequality can go beyond the policy sphere. Quantifying evidence on inequalities requires data, which can be costly and difficult to ascertain. We demonstrate in a practical way how to ensure analysis on how budgets and resources benefit different locations or groups, support national statistical capacities, promote dialogue amongst all stakeholders. This EU Inequalities Guide calls for a shift in our approach to make development cooperation more responsive to this fundamental development challenge. This is needed now more than ever and will help achieve sustainable development that truly leaves no one behind. Use, apply and share this guide and lead the change for a more equal world.
That is a clear call to action that we could lead the change to a more equal world. And that guide really showing how development cooperation could not only be more responsive, but be more effective and sharper as we look at how we reduce inequality sustainably. Really useful to understand those 4 core principles. And of course, not shying away from the complex and difficult challenges that development cooperation has to contend with. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are moving into our panel discussion. I think it's really important for us just to first establish the theme of this conversation. The theme is inequalities in a world in crisis. Now, the context of this is quite important because if we just recall, just last year, the UNDP released a report that told us that even in the shortest of duration, we know that crises have an unequally distributed long-term effect on human development. And so even as we pause and just think about the most vulnerable households in COVID-19, we know that they have borne the bulk of the impact of COVID-19 and this particular crisis. And so as we get into this conversation, the panelists will focus on the implications of this particular crisis for the reduction of inequalities and for international solidarity. And so it's my pleasure to introduce my panelists at this moment. We're joined by the Director General for International Partnerships from the European Commission, Mr. Koen is here with us today. Welcome, Mr. Dunes. Thank you very much for joining us. We know, of course, that your leadership has been front and center in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, the Gulf, Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And we're certainly looking to tap into those insights in this conversation. We're also going to be, we're also joined by Mr. Remy Roux. What an absolute pleasure to welcome you, sir. Of course, he is the Director General of the French Development Agency, and he joins us in this conversation, knowing full well that he has been a champion for development, in particular when we're talking about supporting development in Africa. And so what a privilege for me to be sitting in your offices, sir, here in Johannesburg, South Africa, and contributing to this conversation. We're also joined by Professor Nora Luster. Professor Luster is the Professor of Latin American Economics and is the Director of the Commitment to Equity Institute at Toulon University. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Her research focus is on economic development, inequality, and social policies with an emphasis on Latin America. Professor Luster, lovely to see you again and welcome to the conversation. We look forward to engaging with you today. Ladies and gentlemen, we're also joined at this moment by Madame Gabriella Boucher. She is Executive Director at Oxfam International. We've known her in the global space for being a social justice leader and being a leader that has been deeply committed to gender equality and human rights, as well as tackling economic inequality. So lovely to have you, Madame Boucher. I'm sure you resonated strongly with some of those comments that Commissioner URPILAINEN shared with us as she started. We're also, ladies and gentlemen, joined by Mr. Branko MILANOVIĆ. He is a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. He also is a visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics. His main area of work is income inequality. Mr. MILANOVIĆ, what a pleasure, sir, to have you joining us here today. Thank you very much for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, last but certainly not least, We are going to be receiving a video contribution a little bit later in this conversation from Mr. Magdi Martinez Suleiman, who is the Director General for the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation. And we know his role as having led through the United Nations on the ground for over 18 years in Senegal, in Bangladesh, in Burundi, and in Togo. So we're going to have a very robust conversation, as you can see by the panelists that I have here with me. So Mr. DOENS, allow me to maybe start off with you, sir, in this conversation. If we pause to think about the current sanitary and economic crisis, how does this crisis reconfigure EU development cooperation? Let's kick off there just to hear how you've had to reconfigure and perhaps pivot in terms of development cooperation from an EU perspective. Over to you.
Well, thanks a lot, and first of all, many thanks for being there with you and with such an outstanding panel. I mean, just a few thoughts on your question. First of all, of course, it's a major encouragement to modesty, because I think that the scale, the impact of COVID-19 on partner countries across the globe is absolutely huge. And that what we're trying to do is to try and adjust the way we cooperate to make it as much fit for purpose. The first thing, of course, is one indeed of scale. I think we've come out of a period where gradually we've seen how inequalities between countries have started to diminish at a point in time when inequalities within countries have increased. And it seems that the times we're going through now might actually end up with delivering us again a massive increase in inequalities, not just within countries, but also between countries. If you look at the, let's say, the monetary and fiscal tools that the richer part of the world can dispose of to boost its recovery, and you compare that to the relatively limited firepower of most of the partner countries we're working with, you can see where the danger lies. And so the first thing we're trying to do is to see how can we indeed, as a global community, as a development community, increase that firepower. And that's all the discussions we are having on SDR, on concessional finance, and so on and so on. We, as part of European Development Cooperation, we try to see how ODA can be useful in that extent. That means how we work with development banks. It also means at how we work with the private sector, because it's obviously also the private sector can bring things to the table if it is rightly tuned. So the first thing we're trying to reach is scale in terms of mobilization of means. Secondly, there's a real challenge when it comes to coordination and coherence. It's clear that given the impact of given the seriousness of the challenge, that we need to improve coherence and coordination. On the European side, we've mobilized something that is called Team Europe. It was an innovation where we work in a different way, much more closely with our different member states, so as to really provide our partners with something that is bigger than the sum of its parts. And we're actually pretty proud that over the first months of the crisis last year, we've been able collectively as Team Europe to mobilize around 40 billion euros to support partner countries. But the third thing, in my view, is the most important one. And my commissioner, URPILAINEN, has referred to it. It's, of course, not just about recovery and the scale of recovery. It's about the quality of recovery and the kind of recovery you do. And there we really want to put the social dimension at the heart of it. My commissioner has decided that she wants to significantly increase the amount of spending on education. We will see overall how the amount of spending on human development will increase. And I think that that's of particular importance. To that, in that respect, I think that Europe as a whole really would like to contribute to the kind of policy formatting of the, we tend to pride ourselves of our social market economy, the way in which our society redistributes what it generates. And I think that some of those elements of which we are proud, and I think rightly so. We would definitely want to bring that on board of how we support partners on the recovery. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. I think that's a fantastic start to the conversation. So 3 key points: scale, coordination, and coherence. And I've been hearing the term Team Europe coming across really strongly. So it's really speaking to that coherence and coordination, but also the emphasis on the quality of recovery. I am going to circle back with more questions because I really loved the point you made about potentially formatting or creating a blueprint of policies that work, that can be shared more broadly with the world. And I do want to circle back to that point a little bit later. But for now, let me go to Mr. Hu, because if we think, Mr. Hu, about the current crisis, and a similar question to Mr. Dunes, but thinking about how this crisis has reconfigured development cooperation actions, for a bilateral donor such as the AFD, what has this begun to look like? What configuration potentially has taken place and is taking place?
Merci beaucoup, Nosifo. Je parlerai en français. Merci à tous. Très honoré d'avoir eu la commissaire URPILAINEN, le ministre Clément BEAUNE, pour introduire ces 4
Secretary of State Clément BEAUNE. I would also like to thank all the panelists for being here today. It's a great honor for me to take part to this conference. And I fully share the views expressed by Koen, and I believe that indeed we need to show humility because this is a crucial turning point for development cooperation and sustainable development. And I hope that this is going to speed up our ambitions and the pace of the process, because this is a crisis related to development. It has nothing to do with the financial crisis we had in 2008 and 2009. This crisis affects the economy, the health system, social issues, and we fully understand that we need short-term solutions to the crisis. But contrary to previous crises we had, and the one we had 12 years ago, we also need to think about the world that will come next. We need to have a long-term approach related to the decarbonization of the economies. We need to think about sustainable development goals, and these will shape the way we answer to this crisis. This is also a global crisis, and this is something new. We had the crisis of AIDS 20 years ago. We had the climate crisis, and for the 3rd time, we become aware of a global challenge, and we're all affected as individuals. So it's going beyond the traditional borders we may have with the North, the South, and then this development dimension that is the foundation of our community. And then we discussed this before the crisis, and it's coming back to the table now, and it will be the subject of this conference. We fully understand now that inequalities are a major factor, and that the crisis is affecting strongly the populations that are vulnerable because of their opportunities, because of their age, their race, their gender. And this is a major leverage we have to use to respond to the crisis. So this is a very unique crisis. And as a result, I believe we need to reinvent the way we work, our core business as a development community. As Koen said, of course, we need to remain ambitious, and this is what France is doing. This is what the EU is doing. We want to dedicate 0.55% of our national wealth to development cooperation, but then we need to go beyond this aid, this support, we also need to use the financial leverage. We need to turn to the private sector. And I hope that this is going to happen soon. You may know that there is an important summit on the 18th of May. We will talk about funding for African communities, and we also need to explore new avenues for cooperation. And what we are currently developing in Europe with the Commission and with the DG, INTPA, with Team Europe and SFD Plus and other programs. I believe we have new projects. We have a dialogue that is really using research as a starting point with 32 studies. We have a project. We have this facility that will be discussed during the next 4 days. And of course, then we need to draw lessons from this process and include them in the political process and in all of the projects funded by the EU, either directly or through the institutions of member states, such as ACI in Spain, KfW, AFD in France, and all the colleagues in member states that are trying to achieve the political objectives set by the EU. So I believe that this is an asset we have to use. We need to play the card of solidarity, sustainability, and I hope that the results of these studies will make this approach even more credible and efficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ho. I think it's a very strong and insightful contribution. When you talk about a turning point for development cooperation, it really speaks to the significance of the moment and the need for us to not only focus on the crisis of now, but really to think about the world that comes next. I think the call to action that we're going to be testing in this conversation is the invitation to reimagine and potentially reinvent the working model of development cooperation in its very essence to really respond to the world that we find ourselves in. Allow me maybe to go now to Madame Boucher, because Madame Boucher, if we think about Oxfam, we know that even before the pandemic, Oxfam was already a lead actor on the topic of inequality reduction. And so perhaps to bring COVID-19 into the frame and to ask the question, has this changed your priorities or your approaches in any way?
Thank you, Nosi, and thank you to the FD, Remy, and to the Commission, Koen, for bringing us together. And I think the short answer to your question is yes. And inequality is the defining issue of our time, and we've heard from the previous panelists and the framing of this event. It is stifling the fight against poverty and tearing our societies apart. It's at the core of the struggle for women's rights and also for racial equality. That's why over the last few years, Oxfam has put inequality at the heart of everything we do, from our research and policy to our advocacy and our programs, and to our work with grassroots movements across the globe. So the world COVID-19 entered was already profoundly unequal, in which the last 40 years, the richest 1% have earned more than double the income of the bottom half of the global population, in which nearly half of humanity scraped by on less than $5.50 a day. So such extreme inequality is also inextricably linked to tackling climate breakdown in our economic model. We can't separate the two issues. So our data shows that the richest 1% have consumed twice as much carbon as the bottom 50% for the last quarter of a century, driving climate destruction. So when COVID hit our world and supercharged an already profoundly extreme crisis, in which, as our survey of notable economists across the globe shows, it threatens to increase economic inequality in almost every country at once. And this is the first time this has happened since records began. So the world's 10 richest billionaires have collectively seen their wealth increase by over $500 billion since the start of the pandemic. And it could take the world's poorest people over a decade to recover, so widening the gap even further. So while some governments have taken positive steps, the pandemic has revealed our long-term collective failure to tackle inequality, and our world is paying in lives and livelihoods for this. So in terms of shifts of our priorities, first, actually we're doubling down on the need to not just tinker, but structurally shift our economic model towards greater equality. And we're both excited by the energy of people, ordinary people everywhere, and political and economic leaders across the globe to do something about inequality. And of course, the European Commission is being very clear about this. We're eager to work with more governments, more donors, more institutions on this in very practical ways. And second, taking a multidimensional approach to inequality for us is going to be absolutely crucial. So we need to tackle inequality and reduce it fast. And we can only do this if we understand the different dimensions of inequalities and how they intersect each other, from economic, health, and educational inequalities to political and participation inequalities to identity-based inequalities, particularly gender and race inequalities. All of these constrains people's ability to live the kind of life they want and they value. For example, poor girls are 200 times less likely to finish secondary school than rich boys in many countries. In Guatemala, the infant mortality rate is almost 3 times higher in the bottom quintile, which is also the quintile where there are more ethnic Mayan and Quiche and many other minority indigenous groups who are overrepresented. And this in comparison to the top quintile, who are 38 more times likely to enjoy a college education than those who are so extremely poor. So Oxfam came together with the Center for Analysis of Social Exclusion of LSE and SOAS of the University of London and developed a multidimensional inequality framework, the MIF, to promote a comprehensive and robust understanding of inequalities. So it's an exciting and innovative framework, and it was the basis for the Oxfam's inequality analysis in Central America, West Africa, and Vietnam, which were supported by the EU AFD Inequality Facility. And the idea at the heart of these research projects is to address inequality as a multifaceted phenomenon, broader than economic inequality, and to gather relevant information on the most vulnerable groups from different countries and regions. And we see this framework as something that could be adopted in a practical manner more widely with donors, a bit like Remy was saying about reinventing the practice of development, and of course with governments, and it supports targeting of policies that will have the greatest impact on addressing multidimensional inequalities. So this is, we think, a great contribution that will be presented also during these 4 days in more detail.
Madame Boucher, thank you very much. I mean, I'm going to pick up on one of the lines that I'm sure those who are live tweeting with us on the hashtag Research Inequalities, that for every failure that we've had, we are paying for it in livelihoods today. And if that is not reason enough for us to really reimagine public policy and development cooperation strategies, I don't know what is. But perhaps in addition to that, one of the most important things that you've said, you've reinforced Commissioner URPILAINEN's point of, you talk about a multidimensional understanding of inequality, and she spoke about a cross-cutting approach to inequality, and really reinforcing the point there. But also that perhaps to the point that Mr. Remy Roux was making, that it's time to stop tinkering at the edges and stop tinkering at the periphery and really face the hard structural shifts that are required to reimagine a different world. Allow me now to go to Professor Luster. Professor, I mean, if we're listening to Madame Boucher, she has spoken about a number of regions, but I do want to focus on Latin America with you. How has this pandemic reshaped inequality in Latin America? Professor, you're muted at the moment. If we can unmute you. Thank you very much.
Important to be unmuted. Yes, let me start by thanking the organizers for having me in this very distinguished panel, and thank you, Nosy, for your great moderating role here. I was listening carefully to my predecessors, and I want to thank, take the opportunity to thank AFD that has partnered with us for work, particularly in Africa, with the Commitment to Equity Institute. But like you said, today I'm going to wear my traditional hat of a person that's an expert on Latin American development. And I want to invite the agencies, the European Commission, to look at Latin America in a different light. We know it's a region that's relatively more it's richer than others in the world, but the pandemic has hit it so hard that I think we're going to have to make extra efforts to avoid avoided going backward in ways that may last for decades. In particular, I'm going to share a few statistics and this some analysis with you from a lot of the work that we've been doing at my institute and with partners. But first of all, think about that Latin America has been hit very hard in the health front because it's got only 8% of the population, but about 30% of infected people and more than a third of death in the world. Second, it's also been hit very hard economically. According to the latest numbers from the IMF, they're going to be updated soon, but from the October World Economic Outlook, the region will contract about 8% in 2020. We'll eventually get the actual numbers, but that's very large, and it's higher than in other parts of the developing world. The pandemic and people's response to fend off contagions, the measures designed to contain the spread of the virus took an enormous toll on the region's living standards. And COVID-19 has indeed resulted in sharp increases in inequality and poverty. We have estimates from the UN Economic Commission for Latin America that a third of the regions now is living in poverty. And that's primarily due to the pandemic, and extreme poverty increased across the region last year to levels not seen in the last 20 years. As we all know, Latin America had been experiencing quite a bit of progress at the beginning of the century, so this is a huge reversal. Interestingly, I want to mention that there's been a lot of heterogeneity in the way that countries have responded, and I think we can draw policy lessons from that. For example, we've studied carefully what's happened in the largest countries, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. And it's very interesting because in Argentina, Brazil, they stand out in terms of how they responded to protect living standards of the poor and the sectors that are vulnerable to poverty. Colombia, on the other hand, the efforts have been more limited, and Mexico, they've been downright puny. Argentina and Brazil established demand-driven mechanisms to reach informal workers. At the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was really very worried that it would be very hard to reach sectors of the population that were not under the formal Social Security or the registries of the target cash transfers. Well, we learned that it can be done. Maybe it was not done in a perfect way, clearly, but it could be done. And in Argentina, they ended up reaching about 9 million people. In Brazil, the new programs reach about 50 million people. And thanks to those programs, the poverty that could have risen and inequality could have risen was kept under check. In the case of Argentina, it's a third less of what it could have been done, and much less in Brazil, actually, where the program was much more aggressive. They didn't come cheap. Brazil had to spend about 2% of GDP and Argentina over 1%, but it was part of their countercyclical policies that created less of an aggregate contraction, and importantly, also helped lots of families not to fall into dire poverty. In Colombia, like I said, the coverage and generosity was much less of the expanded safety net, so the curbing of poverty was limited to about 8%. And Mexico, it's strange in a way because people were expecting to see more action, but there was no national level expansion of existing cash transfer assistance, nor introduction of new cash transfer programs. And as a result, there'd be about additional 9 to 10 million new poor in the country, probably the largest number in the region. However, I just want to end with this. Beyond the short-term impact on inequality and poverty, and I'm glad that this was mentioned in the introductory remarks, the pandemic has caused damage for the most vulnerable groups in other dimensions of poverty: nutrition, health, and education. Particularly worrisome is the long-term impact on education in Latin America. According to UNICEF, we know that about 95% of the children and the youth in Latin America were out of school at some point or another. And children in disadvantaged households will end up with lower levels of learning, and many might drop out of school altogether. The current generation of low-income school children may be facing a future with a meager levels of education and high school completion rates last seen in the 1960s. Okay, so going backwards in education is not just bad for the children directly affected, but also Latin America's future could witness losses in economic growth and increased political polarization as a result. So let me stop here. Thank you again.
Professor Luster, thank you very much. I mean, that analysis was both broad and also deep, lifting up some of those nuances of what's not working, but also of opportunities to scale when there are policies that are working, which has been really useful in understanding. And this theme of the long-term effects on education keeps coming back. It started off at the beginning of the conversation, and it certainly keeps repeating itself. Now, Professor MILANOVIĆ, you are in the unfortunate position that, having asked many of the questions, the question I'm going to bring to you almost is asking you to almost react to some of the things that you've heard. Because, I mean, if we think about Prof. Luster, she's just given us the Latin American perspective. And I want to ask you the following. What could be the 2 or 3 priorities for governments in low and middle income countries in order to make sure that we are not aggravating inequality, or this pandemic is not aggravating inequality? And perhaps to Professor Luster's point, that we're not reversing and going backwards to levels not seen since the 1960s in some of the indices. Your thoughts, Professor MILANOVIĆ, on 2 or 3 priorities?
Okay, well, as many politicians do, I'm going to answer the question that I wish I was asked rather than the question that I was asked. So let me say what I would like actually to say, because of course I work on inequality. I don't work necessarily on policies. I would like to distinguish between the different parts of the world. There is no doubt that whatever part of the world you take, morbidity, mortality, have actually hit much more people who are poor in that particular group of the world or the country. There is also no doubt that we will have a significant increase in global poverty. Simply, if you have a decline of GDP of several percentage points, which is actually not seen, I actually believe it's beyond the Great Depression, because the Great Depression had a relatively small decline of global GDP of about 2%. We are actually beyond, this is something unprecedented. However, when it comes to inequality, the situation is a little bit different. So let me divide the world in three groups. The first is really the rich countries. Given the amount of money, particularly in the US and Europe, that is being spent now, I would not be surprised that if the data for 2020 and 2021 show a decline in monetary inequality. So actually we might have a decline in US inequality simply because of the amounts which have gone over like 10% or actually 20% of GDP. And they've been targeted. They've not been ideally targeted, but they've been targeted. So then we might also have a relatively good rebound, particularly in the United States. That's what they're expecting now. So that's for the rich world. Then we come to Latin America that Nora has really brilliantly discussed, and I think to Africa, where the situation, in my opinion, is much worse, simply because they don't have the amounts of money that the rich countries have had to support the poor, and the effects of the crisis, I think, are much deeper. They would push those parts of the world backwards for, like, as Nora said, 10 years or maybe even more. Then the next question is, how will be the rebound there? Because particularly in Africa, I don't see the rebound being generated internally. There is really need for the IMF financing, for the other international institutions and so forth. So these are really the 2 continents which I believe are in the worst shape. Then you come to Asia, and especially to East Asia, where the effects have been the least bad, not only in China, which have had a positive growth rates, and actually, as we know, eliminated entirely the absolute poverty, but in the other countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, the effects, even Indonesia, the effects have been relatively minor compared to the rest of the world. So that part of the world will continue its convergence with the rest of the world. And then you actually come to the global level, and there you have, of course, a very peculiar situation that the convergence of East Asia, particularly of China, is making the world less unequal, But because China has become a relatively rich country, its contribution is small now. Hence, India's role becomes crucial. Unfortunately, India had a very substantial decline this year. And that could very easily make the overall inequality go up. So we are really in a very peculiar situation that we have never experienced because different parts of the world have been affected very differently. And even if there are certain similarities, as I said in the beginning, in morbidity, mortality rates, poverty within each country, when you translate them globally, you get a picture which is, I think, quite unique. So this is what I would like to say. Now, there will be some policies which would sort of be derived from that. In my opinion, when I was saying for Africa and Latin America, the most important policy is international support. And because I'm particularly concerned about Africa, with a place of the world with a high population growth rates, this cannot be done endogenously facing a crisis of this proportion.
Professor MILANOVIĆ, that's a beautiful way of asking, of responding to a question you didn't want to respond to. But I think what you've done is you've lifted a very interesting global picture. I did see Mr. Koen in my frame vigorously taking notes as you're speaking. So I'm keen to hear him reacting to some of the things that you have raised for us. But the point that you make about Africa and the need for external partners to really step in for the recovery really speaks to the point that we heard from Mr. Clément, who was talking about the importance of seeing ourselves as primary actors that is going to bring about this global recovery. I'm hoping we're going to get an opportunity to circle back to some of these issues. I want to reiterate to our global audience that is watching right now, we're keen to hear your voice. So send us your questions, send us your comments, and I'll try and integrate them into the conversation. Let me circle back to Madame Boucher, if we will. Madame, what do you believe, having listened to these first contributions, what do you believe is the biggest threat to global recovery in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic? What is the single most biggest threat that you think could completely derail any intentions of us moving forward? Madam, if you can unmute.
Yes,
thank you.
Sorry. Yes. Thank you. Well, like Professor MILANOVIĆ says, it's a difficult thing to generalize and to answer as one big, but I think the one big thing that is now the inequality issue for all of us is the vaccine issue. Because in reality, as we know, there is difference in access to vaccines in the rich world, but also extreme difference between the developing world and the wealthy economies. So as we know, as we stand today, only 1 in 10 people in the lower and middle income countries will be accessing the vaccine in this year, which will be a challenge for the economic recovery, let alone what was said earlier about the difficulty in having the large injections of support. And as Professor Lustig was saying, some countries have increased their access to large populations, and others, for example, the case in Mexico that you were quoting, is very limited. So of course, those two things combined, the lack of vaccines and the limited investments in the most at-risk populations, will be very, very challenging. But beyond that, what we see is that the big risk is that we actually continue with the measurements that we had before. So focusing on GDP growth and not looking at the huge disparities. And particularly, we have seen it very clearly with COVID exposed. And again, in Latin America, you know, an Afro-Brazilian is much more likely to die of COVID than a white Brazilian in an urban area. So we have to think of those rural, urban differences, ethnic differences, gender differences, and how policies are focused on people and their well-being, very much maybe like New Zealand and Vietnam type of measurements are doing, rather than thinking only on GDP. And then also to think about how is it going to be financed. And it's interesting of developing cooperation supporting also the development of progressive taxation that helps bring about the required funding for this recovery. And Argentina is an example with the one-off wealth tax for the COVID recovery, and that can be replicated in other countries. But it's one of the ways in which also obviously the inequality is reduced. And finally, I think very importantly for development cooperation, to in this reinvention, to really focus on measures that really address reducing inequality and really changing and targeting in a very different way. And I think the other panelists have mentioned some of the ideas of what would happen in that area. But we are very grateful also that already in this collaboration that has happened within this facility in focusing on inequality, we've been able to go deeper in what it has meant and how we need to understand very specifically the context in which we want to intervene.
Thank you very much, Madame Boucher. And you've raised perhaps one of the biggest talking points globally right now, of course, is the conversation around the vaccines. And you've lifted that up as one of the biggest threats that we could see an aggravation, if you will, of inequality. You've spoken about limited investment. So if we continue to tinker at the edges, play at the periphery, we might see this. But also, I think your point that you make about if we continue as business as usual when it comes to the metrics and what we're measuring and to the funding, and also how we are framing inequality. And increasingly we're hearing in this conversation that we need to have a much more broader, multifaceted definition of inequality that looks at identities amongst many other things. One of the things that I probably want to just sneak in, which is also one of the questions that have come from our global audience, Madame Boucher, is to say, well, we're talking about the biggest threats right now, but what is potentially, in your view, the biggest opportunity that if we got this right, we might really have a shot at meeting Sustainable Development Goal number 10, as was started off in the conversation. I do want you to think about that. I have another question from our global audience that I'll bring to my next person. But for now, to you, what is the biggest opportunity, Madame Boucher?
I think the biggest opportunity is around investment in essential services like health, education, social protection. So we have the big opportunity now is to really understand the difference. We've all understood it, I think, this year. The underinvestment in health is not acceptable, and we need to create the fiscal space in many of the African countries, and that includes addressing the SDR issue, debt issues, and supporting strengthening the effective collection of taxes, and so that there can be investment in health, education, and social protection. That's the opportunity we have collectively.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Madame Boucher. So allow me to come to you, Prof. Luster. I mean, we've been talking about now the biggest threats to recovery. We've just lifted from Madame Boucher the biggest opportunity, but perhaps let's bring this together and put the question to you, what would be the ideal recovery path in terms of public policy? What would that path really, really look like?
All right, thank you again. Well, I think one thing is that recovery should be quick, and particularly should be labor intensive. So reining in fiscal deficits that in many countries have expanded quite significantly in the past year through either spending cuts or tax increases has to be gradual. And I think that here is where the international organizations and bilateral donors can play a role, even for middle-income countries. If we force countries to tackle the fiscal situation all too quickly, then recovery will not happen. And the problems that we're facing now in terms of rising inequality, rising poverty will be exacerbated. So it is key what happens at the macroeconomic level. At this point, I think that's key. The second thing I want to emphasize, and following up on what Madame Boucher said, is that I want to sort of continue harping on the issue of education. I think that we do need to put emphasis on containing the longer term effects that school closures have meant. Let me remind you that the projections that we made for Latin America is that the likelihood of today's students to complete secondary education in Latin America might soon drop from a regional average of 61% to 46%. And that if we look at the children that come from low education background parents, the decrease could be from 52% high school completion to 32%, while children in the upper ladders of socioeconomic of the socioeconomic ladder in the upper echelons would probably feel almost nothing. They would continue to be able to graduate at the same pace. So can something be done to prevent this unequalizing force from happening? Remember that this can be a lasting scar for decades. So to soften the negative impact of school closures on children, even though governments are experimenting with different strategies in terms of reopening schools, it's not going to be enough. And you will need to accompany this by increasing both the amount and quality of learning time. School systems will need to contemplate extended schedules, summer and after school programs, and more personalized instruction. And this will require not only government efforts, it will require efforts on the part of the for-profit and not-for-profit private sector. We call for a crusade if you want to deal with this. The remedial actions will require resources, especially financial ones. So one key recommendation is for governments not to cut education spending when they face the inevitable need to rein in fiscal deficits. In fact, if anything, fiscal resources devoted to education may need to rise. So let me stop here.
Sure, Professor Luster. So a quick recovery as a priority, focusing on what we're doing at a macroeconomic level, but also really taking seriously the funding policy on education right now, and almost being put at a place where we've got to reimagine how we can accelerate what has been lost in terms of those school closures that we've seen. I've got a question here that has come from our global audience, and I'm going to take it to Prof. MILANOVIĆ first, but I'm keen if anybody else wants to take a bite of it. Mr. DOENS and Mr. Hu, I'm going to certainly come to you shortly, but Prof. MILANOVIĆ, here's the question. The question is, what is the difference between reducing inequality and reducing poverty? And if there is a difference, what should that look like from a development cooperation perspective?
Yeah, there is a difference. These are two different things. Reducing inequality simply means making fewer people poor, regardless of whatever you define as the poverty line. Technically speaking, very often when you reduce poverty, you also reduce inequality because these people are poor. And by being poor, they increase inequality. So if you make them less poor, you're also reducing inequality. But the two things are clearly different. You can also reduce inequality by making the rich people less rich. So that also reduces inequality and does not affect the poverty. So the two concepts are, different. I would also like to say that actually I'm very much in agreement with what both Gabriela and Nora said about the importance of education and health. I think for the world, this could be, if it continues, the crisis, could be a little bit like the Cultural Revolution was for China. If you don't have kids going to school for 2 years on a permanent basis, you really lose, you're beginning to lose a generation. So it's a serious matter. I would also finally like to mention something that was not mentioned, but it was something that should make us think, reflect deeply. It is total lack of preparation to face the crisis. And it was not something in poor countries, it was actually most striking in rich countries. We have seen that quite well, and I don't need to dwell on this. But the important part is how wrong we were as scientists in guessing which countries are prepared for the crisis. As I've written about that, you have seen Johns Hopkins report and the Economist Intelligence Unit published it uncannily like 2 months before the pandemic, which listed the US, UK, and the Netherlands as the most prepared for the pandemic. And listed countries like Thailand and Vietnam and China, like really in the middle or lower middle. So we should really think about what we believe we are doing with these mashup indices and other estimates, where they are actually been found to be so dramatically different from the reality. So that's actually a question really for the scientists or for people who do this work.
Prof. MILANOVIĆ, I've got Prof. Luster putting up her hand as you are speaking, so I'm sure that she wants to hopefully challenge what you have to say, but of course you can also reinforce what you've shared with us. Prof. Luster, over to you.
Yeah, no, I never challenged Branko. So, no, I totally agree with him. But I just wanted to emphasize when regarding the question about inequality and poverty, I mean, you can reduce poverty just by growth with increasing inequality. I mean, that's what happened in China. A lot of the reduction in poverty in China, which everybody considers to be so amazing, which is amazing, was primarily growth driven, while inequalities were rising tremendously in China. So you can have things going in opposite directions. Ideally, I mean, and by the way, during the process of development, you may have a rise in inequality that may not be bad. We have to be careful. Not everything that happens in the inequality front is always bad, because it's, I mean, it's part of a natural process of when you move from rural to urban areas, when you have part of the population becoming more educated at the beginning before everybody is able to access education, you may have rising inequalities that you not necessarily want to stop. But it's bad when you have inequalities that are inherently linked to structural factors like discrimination, lack of opportunity, and things that actually are barriers for people to be able to profit from economic growth. That is the key in a development strategy. I also want to finish with something that I was reading this past week. I don't know how many of you have seen the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation latest report. And there's something that I think we need to take very seriously now that Branko mentioned how wrong we were in predicting. Part of the problem, I think, was not bad preparation scientifically. I think we also need to understand the political dynamics that the pandemic leashed, which led to bad preparation in many places. But one thing that this report showed, or at least argued, is that we may not be able to reach herd immunity, in particular because of how bad the vaccination process is going. And that maybe the pandemic will not be a pandemic, but will become a seasonal problem to have COVID every year in different seasons. So we have to be prepared for that, because we don't know, I mean, maybe the worst part will be curbed, but we don't know whether we're going to have this with us for much longer than we anticipate. And I think the strategic response has to be very mindful of that as a possibility.
Professor Luster, thank you very much. I'm going to jump to Mr. Roux and Mr. Koen for a moment. I'm going to circle back to you, Madame Boucher. There's quite a debate going on around this question that's come in. But Mr. Roux, let me come to you first. I mean, having listened to what has been a really, really robust conversation, what role do you see public development banks in particular, what role do you see them playing in mainstreaming the fight against inequality?
Dimension, the micro-financial dimension, and it is essential to have cash available for all the regions of the world. But that cash must be translated into concrete investments in essential services. So it must reach out to all groups of population that are the most vulnerable ones. So the main problem, the issue, the crisis that we are experiencing is the macro-financial challenge and the need to reinvent the access to instruments in order to reach out to the most isolated, the most vulnerable groups of population. Just like in any big crisis, for a few months, we have again focused on public development banks in their capacity to tie the macroeconomic dimension and the macro and the microeconomic dimension. all those banks are getting bigger and bigger, and while keeping in mind the long-term challenges, the long-term structural changes. Last year, we did a little research with the University of Beijing, and we made an inventory of the public development banks, and there were 453 of them. $2,000 billion of investments per year. So we were wondering if we are well organized, if we give the right incentives with a better and more public management, we couldn't better respond to the crisis. There are a lot of them in Latin America. There is about 100 of them, the BNBS, DCAR, the Inter-American Development Bank. There are a lot of them in Africa as well. In South Africa too, I'm thinking of our colleagues of the DVSA. So there are about 100 of such banks in Africa as well. Afrexim Bank, for example, plays a key role in giving access to vaccination to many African countries. With multilateral mechanisms. And last year, with the conference Finance in Common, the European Union was very present into that conference. And actually, all these public development banks have clearly understood the issue of inequalities. They have clearly understood that we need to fight climate change, to have more biodiversity. And at the same time, we need to take care. We need to address the social problems to make sure that these different interventions are sustainable. So these public development banks play a key role in reducing inequalities, but it is a bit vague, a bit mysterious. We are all trying to find the best methods, and there is also the principle of accountability with regard to the Sustainable Development Objectives. And what is happening is quite interesting. It's far from being perfect, but if we organize all this as a big global financial infrastructure broken down per region of the world, if we connect that to the government and their budget capacities, that are key for health and education, if we link it up to the central banks that are also looking at climate change, then we would have more public investments to prepare the future and to be better prepared to face future crises. This is what we are being building, and the AFD, just like the Director General of Koen, we're trying to build capacity, to organize, to set a big group of public development banks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roux, for that response. As you're looking at concrete investments and, of course, looking at reimagining financial instruments, a quick follow-up to you, Mr. Roux, before I move on. One of the themes that has been also surfacing in this conversation has been the opportunity for the private sector to play a bigger role as we think about this recovery. Very quickly, what would have the greatest impact when we're talking about bigger role from the private sector? How can the private sector really have a meaningful impact? What suggestions might you have for us?
Through a very serious and deep economic crisis. So job creation, revenue, and the situation of the most vulnerable groups of population will depend on the capacity of the public sector to pick up. And when I was talking about the public development banks, it was not just for the sake of them, but because these banks must have the capacity to mobilize foreign investments and to turn them into long-term investments. There are a lot of public financial institutions that are dedicated to the public sector. The so-called DFIs, the development financial institutions, and a lot of them have a great deal of expertise in strengthening companies, private companies. So it is very important to use these institutions, especially at a time when private investments are getting lower, especially at a time where the sector of companies could be torn apart with all the social consequences that this may have. So the international cooperation must earmark more resources to the private sector to allow for a high recovery, a dynamic recovery. I think the European Union is quite active, quite dynamic within the European Union itself to start with, but also at international level.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that response, Mr. Hu. As we think about, how can DFIs also crowd in private sector investment, as you've indicated, this might be one of the ways that we can really see a quality recovery coming through and an accelerated recovery. Now, Mr. Jones, I'd like to maybe bring your voice back into this conversation and ask you the first question, which is, what could be the role of the EU in particular with supporting these public development banks that Mr. Hu was responding to in their fight towards reducing inequality as part of the recovery process? How can the EU support?
Well, thanks a lot. And I mean, it's always pleasant to see so much juice coming out in such a short amount of time. And what I've heard from Professor Lustig, MILANOVIĆ, from Gabriella was, I mean, I would have many comments to make and questions to ask. But I would maybe want to start with a point that both Professor MILANOVIĆ and Lustig made, which I find particularly interesting as an angle, which is that indeed there are parts of the world, Latin America, but certainly Africa, that will depend very strongly from the international support to really drive their recovery. Now, of course, money is only part of the equation. Ultimately, it's about policy choices that are being made, and policy choices are first of all political and in certain cases ideological, but money, of course, does play a role there. And what I'm seeing is that there might be a temptation to focus the recovery precisely on growth, on boosting GDP, on having job creation, hopefully connected with a forward-looking agenda linked to low carbon, digital agenda, and so on. But what I hear is that precisely the key when it comes to inequalities is to focus on those issues that affect lack of opportunity, and therefore education, and therefore health, and therefore particular attention to the gender angle. And I'm not sure that naturally the money that is mobilized will flow to what ultimately is more long-term investment, education, health, and so on. And that puts us before a certain responsibility, which is the question, how can we, when we mobilize as an international community to support those parts of the world, to what extent can we, as we mobilize funding, influence some of the policy choices that are made? And that brings us indeed, I mean, it goes beyond the support we provide to public development banks. It basically touches everything, the support we provide to governments, the support we provide to private sector. and to the public development banks. And there, when it comes to the PDBs, the real question will be, how can we engage with them in a way that makes them look beyond, let's say, financial returns when looking at returns on investment, which automatically would drive them more to the job GDP boosting side of the equation, and how can we make sure that the impact on human capital is more taken on board when they look at what's my return on investment. And here I think with ODA, with some of our new innovative instruments like the guarantees, like blending and so on, we can make an impact, because that to a certain extent, through the governance of the whole system, I wouldn't say puts us in a driving seat, but definitely allows us to influence to what kind of, let's say, support, what kind of funding areas we lend our support. And as you will have heard from Jutta URPILAINEN, from my commissioner, it's our very clear intention to make sure that notably education, and then particularly with the gender angle taken into account, but notably education is fully at the heart of what we will do.
I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you a follow-up question, Mr. DOENS, because this is really a response to one of the earlier phrases that you used. You used the phrase of firepower. You said we should really try and increase our firepower. So here's the question from our global audience. The question is, what role do you see for debt cancellation as a way of reducing inequality between countries and increasing development countries' firepower? And might you also comment on what the EU and member states are doing to compel private creditors to take part in debt relief initiatives? If you could take a stab at that question from our audience, please, Mr. DOENS.
Yes, with pleasure. I think obviously when you look at firepower, debt relief must be part of the equation. And I think that we can say with a certain level of pride that the European Union, our member states, because we as an EU, we are not a creditor, but our member states are, that they have taken an extremely forward-leaning approach on this topic. First of all, when it came to the DSSI in the G20. Secondly, when it comes to the common framework, which was developed and which indeed brings the private sector fully on board. We continue, EU member states, to drive this agenda as ambitiously as possible, because we do think that debt relief, debt rescheduling is one of the important building blocks. It's not the only one, but it's one of the important building blocks of precisely providing that fiscal space to partner governments that they need.
Thank you very much, Mr. DOENS. So it really is about creating that fiscal space for response. Now, Professor MILANOVIĆ, I do want to come to you, but before I do, I have to honor the hand that I saw being raised earlier on in the conversation. I want to go back very briefly to Madame Boucher. I think you wanted to make a contribution to the conversation as we're talking about, whether the emphasis is on reducing inequality or reducing poverty. Madame Boucher, a quick response from you, and then Prof. MILANOVIĆ, I'll come right back to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think it's along the lines of what we're talking about, the reimagining. So somehow the focus on reducing poverty assumes growth, and in a way doesn't, growth that is possibly unsustainable. So because the big element that we need to come back to all the time is the climate crisis in which we are. So only focusing on reducing poverty doesn't take into consideration that the equation of the consumption of the wealthiest in any society, but of course the wealthiest countries, is very much another dimension. And then I wanted to briefly, if I may, also respond a bit to what Koen was saying just a moment ago in terms of the policy choices. So these are very political discussions for each country to have. And I think there's an interesting role there for civil society also, because the other big inequality that we haven't talked about is inequality in voice. So it's political voice. So wealth and income and other forms of sort of power allow some sectors of society to have a greater voice. So how do we as civil society also work together with those who are unfortunately at the moment not so visible in their voice, and make sure the policies really impact them? So it's gender and very much racial, ethnic dimensions that are often left behind, and we can't afford to do this again. So this time the reimagining is for everybody.
Sure, thank you very much, Madame Boucher. Certainly in inequality, we haven't spoken about the inequality of voice and how that is manifested in who gets a seat at the table, who gets to influence policy, who gets to influence even a strategy that we're taking more broadly. So, Prof. MILANOVIĆ, I want to come back to you. I want to give you first an opportunity to react to any of the comments that you've heard so far. One of the things I've been loving about this conversation is the reactions amongst yourselves, but also, Prof, if you could just talk to us about what you now believe, having listened to this conversation, should be the priorities for bilateral development cooperation. What are the priorities that should be top of mind as we look towards a more qualitative, more sustainable recovery path?
Well, thank you very much. I'm really simply going to echo what people have said before. I believe that in many countries, the crisis will show that insufficient investments in health and education have led to, to make the crisis much worse than it would have been otherwise. I mean, particularly in health, but education is the result of the pandemic. So I believe that really much greater effort needs to be done in that respect. I totally think that some kind of debt forgiveness or rescheduling is certainly in order for poorer countries. Of course, that has been done in the past, so it is not something that we are now, it's the first time that we are doing it. So these would be my sort of general conclusions. I do think, however, that growth is important, but that of course leads us to this endless discussion about the limits to growth. I believe that for middle income and other countries, growth is absolutely crucial. We have seen that in the case of China. We can see it in the case of India. India has been actually growing faster than China prior to the crisis. There is no way that you can actually increase incomes in India without growth. And that's about 1.4 billion people. So my sort of, have to say, general disagreement with the people with emphasis on some kind of degrowth is quite strong. So I think actually we need growth. We need it more than ever, and health and education.
Professor MILANOVIĆ, I certainly hope that the growth debate is going to germinate even more in the coming days, and that it's really going to be one of the most robust things that we're going to be talking about, because I think it's very, very important that we actually really thrash this out as much as possible. I am near the tail end of the conversation, but Mr. Hall, I just want to come back to you. One of the things I've heard you say repeatedly, you've used the word reinvent twice. I've heard the word reimagine from your fellow panelists. I've heard the word rethink from your fellow panelists. And so I'm hearing a theme about really needing to reimagine development cooperation more broadly. And suppose the question to you, Mr. Hu, is what is the mindset that you think is going to be required if we are really going to build a better world from here on? You spoke about reimagining the core business model, but what is the mindset that you think leaders, irrespective of the space they find themselves in, are going to have to adopt and embrace if we are really going to see this far more qualitative recovery? Mr. Hu, please.
The political level, but also at the operational level of the institutions we are leading. And I would say that we have to combine short-term and long-term. Of course, we have to be extremely agile, reactive, listening to the needs the population and the requests of the governments as rapidly as we can, and sometimes we're not as rapid as we should. But as Koen said, the whole group of European institutions reacted quite well, I think, last year. But the crisis is ongoing, and we have to keep this momentum. But be very cautious also to factor in what we think about long term, about the world after. I mean, not tomorrow, but after tomorrow. I think what we think about 2030 for SDGs, what we think about 2050 for carbon neutralities, and make the connections between these two dimensions probably as never before. And this is where research is so important, and being connected with academics and learning from them as we did today, and try to design our operations as precisely and as informed as possible, especially in the field of inequalities. But since all issues are now clearly interconnected, and since we certainly have to change the way we do business, this is where fora like the one we will have this week is so crucial for all of us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roux. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I did promise you that we are going to hear from, of course, Mr. Martinez Suleiman. But I do want to just reinforce the point that Mr. Roux has just made. We need to reimagine, both from a political perspective, from an operational perspective, but also from our frame of thinking. And we have to go really think in terms of the long term as we think about the multiple worlds that we're going to be engaging with. Now, I've got about 4 minutes before I get to this contribution from Mr. Martinez Suleiman, which means I've got 4 minutes with my current panelists. So this is what I'm going to suggest to my panelists. I really want to close off this conversation in a memorable and fun way. So here's the challenge I'm going to put to you. I'm going to ask each and every one of you to imagine a billboard, a big billboard in the busiest city in your country. And that billboard has a slogan on it, and that slogan speaks to the conversation we're having today about reducing inequality. But the statement starts off with, "We can." And you need to complete the sentence. Now, remember, I know I've got a lot of professors here. I've got a lot of high-level panelists. It is not a paragraph. It is not an executive summary. It is not a report. It is merely a sentence. We can. And of course, if you're looking away, Professor MILANOVIĆ, that always tells me that you probably want to be the first one to go. So here is me taking a stab at it. I'm going to go to Madame Boucher first. She's got a big smile on her face, so I'll go to her first. Madame Boucher, we can.
We can together decide to have equality between genders, racially, and ensure opportunity for all.
That's a big billboard, Madame Boucher, but it's certainly there. We can together to have equality between genders and ensure that we have equality for all. It's a fantastic billboard, one that I wouldn't mind being stuck in traffic reading. So let me now go to Prof. MILANOVIĆ. Prof, as you look away from me, I know that strategy to try and not go next, but let me hear your thoughts, Prof. We can.
We can be equally happy.
Thank you very much, Prof. I must say that's going to be hard to beat. We can be equally happy. It's going to be very, very hard to beat. So, Prof. Luster, we can?
Not sure. We can try.
We can try. Wow, I think you might have won on Prof. MILANOVIĆ. So I'm going to give the last word to Mr. June. So I'm going to go to Mr. Remy Roux next. Mr. Roux, we can?
We can invent a world in common.
Oof, they're getting better and better. We can invent a world in common. Mr. DOENS, you get to take us home. We can? You're muted, sir.
We can equalize it.
We can equalize it. So it's a thumbs up for Madame Boucher. Very big thank you to our panelists. Before you go away, please stay tuned as we turn over our focus now to this short contribution from Mr. Magdi Martinez Suleiman, who of course is the Director General of the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation, who could not be with us today, but certainly wanted to contribute to this conversation.
I would like to thank the organizers, AFD and DEVCO, for affording me the opportunity to address you by video. I wouldn't have liked to miss it. The Research Facility on Inequalities plays an important role by providing reliable evidence on the state of the issue, the social impact of policies, and the cost effectiveness of our interventions. Thus, on behalf of the Spanish Agency for International Development, AECID, I would like to thank and congratulate the European Commission's Directorate General for International Partnerships and the Agence Française du Développement for holding this conference. We're all committed to reducing inequalities at home and abroad, between people and between peoples. Partnerships are key in pursuing the SDGs on evidence. Spain supports the work of the Research Facility on Inequalities. The concept in itself has been studied by the UN and academia for decades, starting with Nobel laureate Amartya Sen in Stanford and his seminal human development concept that was then developed by UNDP, all the way to Thomas Piketty and Joseph Stiglitz, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee and their Rethinking Poverty, or Jeff Sachs and his Earth Institute at Columbia in New York City. At home, in Spain, Professor Adela Cortina has recently written about aporophobia, or the fear of the poor, which generates hatred, rejection, and doubles down on inequality. We have also learned and applied the multidimensional measurements and underlying conceptions of poverty by Oxford University and Coneval in Mexico and Professor Hernandez Licona there. As a Mexican president said once, in our south, equality is about food. In our north, inequality is about shelter. Everywhere, it is about governance. Professor Sen famously asked himself, equality of what? From our perspective, the fight against poverty and inequality goes way beyond SDGs 1 and 10. We do not see a sum of inequalities piling up that from a policy perspective could be resolved by peeling them away one by one, but rather intersecting factors which generate contexts of inequality qualitatively different to the mere sum of the effects of each discrimination. Policy has hence to be complex and comprehensive. Social housing is good, but you could end up having malnourished, unemployed, and illiterate families in rent-controlled apartments. Our policies and our governments, development banks, and NGOs focus on themes such as employment, education, health, gender equality, or climate change, and try out the sectoral approach to reducing inequalities in our partner countries. Our contribution to international organizations follows the same rationale, as well as our cooperation with the European Union. We divide the labor. It is harder to divide poverty in its causal origins. It is indeed extremely difficult to analyze the multiple factors of inequality and focus on the key ones. Social mobility through education, the environmental security, including food and water security, health, where the intersectionality of poverty and inequality is particularly visible, where 1% of the wealthy have greater chances to being 1% of the healthy, and the gap is widening. Technology and productivity for more and more decent jobs, equal pay and care industry for a gender equality boost, all seem so very important that it is hard to make choices. Multisectoral, multifunctional approaches remain necessary, I guess my point is that we need not to get distracted by an endless catalogue of miniature support actions and take the less traveled road of prioritizing and then stick with it. We're looking forward to grasping the contributions of this final conference and of the DAC's newly created community of practice on poverty and inequalities. We are very interested in the work of agencies such as UNDP around inequality and the poverty trap and fragile governance, in particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, Spain's priority development cooperation region. Reducing poverty, closing many of the inequality gaps, in particular related to gender and ethnic backgrounds, are top priorities of our feminist foreign policy because they are coherent with priorities in domestic policy. Coherence all around is very much needed if one's development cooperation is to have a shred of credibility. If you do not pursue social cohesion at home, it's hard to support social cohesion overseas. But on the other hand, if you do, the word of coherence is trustworthiness, one of the building blocks of international development cooperation. I thank you for your attention.
It's a very big thank you to Mr. Martinez Suleiman for really weighing into the conversation, almost as if he was a part of this robust discussion, really touching on many of the key issues that we've raised, including some connection or dot connects back to our keynote addresses. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, with your permission, I've got about 2.5 minutes. I'd like to use that time to really just lift some of the key points that have come out of this conversation. We have heard today that perhaps our greatest opportunity is to really look at scaling the work that we're doing, to stop playing at the periphery and really look at the structural changes that might bring about a qualitative recovery. One of the key words that was used and that I'm sure is going to reflect in the social media is we've got to up our firepower. So we've got that in the bag. We've also had a huge focus today in this conversation on a qualitative recovery that puts human development at the center and does not just look at the traditional GDP metrics to really look at recovery, but really looks at putting people and societies at the center. We heard today from Mr. Remy Roux that this moment in history is a turning point for development cooperation. And because it's a turning point, we heard the invitation to reinvent ourselves, to reimagine our institutions, to rethink our business models and how we partner together for a better world. We heard today that we've got to think about all the variables. We've got to think about growth. We've got to think about poverty reduction. We've got to think about increasing incomes, all in a concerted effort to have a multifaceted and multidimensional approach to reaching sustainable goal number 10. We heard a conversation about education today and really shining the light on the risk of cutting education spending. And perhaps one of the ways that we really make an impacted qualitative recovery is to reimagine how we get back on track with education and accelerate. We heard that we need to think about inequality in a much more broader way. We need to think about inequality of voice, inequality of power, inequality that is brought about by gender and other identity markers that really gives us a much more workable understanding of how we tackle inequality. We also heard about the call to action of being primary actors in some regions of the world that might not be able to recover on their own. Africa and Latin America came up repeatedly in this conversation. And perhaps one final point that was also now made by Mr. Martinez Suleiman, but certainly that was made in the conversation, is social cohesion. We've got to really think about coming together socially cohesively as one of the ways of having a more inclusive recovery. And so as I end off this conversation, I'd like to thank very much my panelists. I want to extend a massive thank you to Mr. Koen, a massive thank you to Mr. Remy Roux, Madame Boucher, to Professor Luster, to Professor MILANOVIĆ for your contributions, and to Mr. Martinez Suleiman in his absence. As we gear up for the next 4 days, ladies and gentlemen, let us remember that this pandemic has really been what the Commissioner has described as an X-ray, in the sense that it has revealed stark inequalities, and that our work as we lift the lessons from this research facility is to really think about how do we not aggravate inequality, how do we ensure that we are not undermining social progress that has been made already. Let's also remember that as this pandemic increases gaps between the poorest and the richest, that what we've heard today and what we're going to be building on in the days to come is examples of recovery policies and strategies to curb this very trend. And perhaps the last word is solidarity is going to be key. If we heard the final statement from each of our panelists, it started off, we can, and that really speaks to the solidarity that's going to be required going forward. I do hope that you enjoy the sessions and that you participate fully, that you continue to send us your questions and your comments. A very big thank you to my panelists, a very big thank you for the invitation to moderate this opening plenary. I'll see you at the closing. For myself in Johannesburg, South Africa, it's goodbye for now.